There's only one issue that any of us face, and that's the belief that we are separate from our source. And we can't see that. We think we've got at least 150 other issues that we're dealing with. But they're all offshoots of that one, just that one. Even the issue of the belief in sin originated because we thought we could separate ourselves from the source of love. And what happens when you become separated from love? Sin happens. The idea that something is wrong. Unless there's something else that you want to discuss before we get started, why this will be a good place to leap in. We just coincidentally happen to be yesterday and today at two lessons that will illustrate what we're talking about perfectly. So I'd like to let the lessons lead us and start with them. And as we go, let's watch. Each of us watch for what the lessons are describing, happening, as Sally was pointing out, happening in your life today. Just look for the key elements that are coming to you, and then you begin to ask yourself, well, why is this lesson like that? Isn't this something this lesson's talking about exactly? No, all of this orchestration is happening because we are the ones who are orchestrating it. Well, you might say then, well, what part does God play in this? Same part. This is what it means, what the Course means when it says, you are a part of God. So whenever it refers to anything being of God's creation, or anything similarly, you will know it's your creation. We are reaching the point where it is no longer feasible to separate ourselves in any way from the concept of God. Now you think about that. Think where that's really taking us. The healing of this concept of separateness can only go as far as our willingness to accept that we are a part of God. That we are, in fact, God. We are the creator of all that is. That's who we are. How does that feel? When you want to back away from it, when you want to deny it, say, yeah, but, or maybe tomorrow, or, No. It's happening. It's happening now. We're all doing what we're doing now because we are willing to see it and accept it. And not just here, not just in this room, everywhere in the world. What do you think Brother means when he says, together we can change the world? The key word, together.
This is why he says, I need your help.
Yes, absolutely, Brian. It's more than a need. It happens when we are together, and it doesn't when we turn away from it. It's happening. In any regard, it's happening. But we will see it when we join with the one. Don't belittle your part. What I think you will find helpful is to begin to relate, as we go through this, to how what it's speaking of here seems to be currently playing a part in your life, so that we can come to recognize that nothing that is happening is by accident, and there are no coincidences. We are the ones who are planning for our so-called salvation. We are the God that is orchestrating all of this. The only distinction is we seem to want to play a different part. And as we do, that creates a sense of conflict between what is and what isn't. So now we're going to allow ourselves to begin to admit, to not deny any longer the role we play, the God that makes us all whole. Isn't that a funny feeling? We've been toying with this for so long. God is what God has created. The sum of all creation is what God is. So what part are you in that creation? There will always be the presumption of guilt until you recognize that you are the one who is making the pronouncement. So everything that we have ever attributed to God, you're going to have to claim for yourself because that's who you are. It's almost delicious to listen to what the ego has to say about it, isn't it? Oh yeah, but come on now, you got whatever. It's like there were 10 tape recorders going off in my head at the same time. 4 or 5 years ago, in one of my conversations with Brother, he says, you do realize, of course, that you are fast approaching the time when it will no longer be necessary for you to think of death. I didn't recognize all of the forms. I still don't recognize all of the forms that what he refers to as death entails. But I find it more simple to sum them all up and just think of anything that does not allow me or encourage me to be totally happy is the thought of death. And I just so appreciate being able to reflect back on what he has said, that we, not just me, we, all of us, are approaching a time when it is no longer going to be necessary for us to feel anything except supremely happy. Now, he says, this is what will change the world. The recognition that there is no purpose, no function, only nonsense, in the belief that anything is necessary except that we feel happy. Such a simple thing, to allow ourselves to be happy. We do not want to be a witness to death, but how many of us believe that death is inevitable? Well, maybe in the experience of the consciousness as a whole, it might seem to take a little more time for us to deal with the idea of death. But we can deal today with what he suggests in all of these lessons. We can change our mind today about what we want to have for ourselves. We can decide, you can decide, I can decide that I want to be a witness to love and not to fear and pain. And then I can step back and I can look at all of the examples of fear and pain that are happening in the world and say to myself, that's not me. If it happens to me, it's still not me. We've spoken before about how the meaning of things always accommodate the belief from which they are seen. In other words, when you're speaking of time, it doesn't make any sense to say nothing can die. But when you begin with the awareness that we are eternal beings, what part could dying play? It can only refer to a part of our story, our body, a part of our story that we're letting go of, and how we resist doing that. We've always thought of the one who lives the longest as the one who played the best game. There used to be a lot of people that would come when I first began to channel, so-called, and ask Brother questions about, well, what did you mean when you said this? Or is this really true? Or this and this? And inevitably, he will say a variation on what I'm going to say to you. what difference does it make? What meaning are you giving it? The world can either be seen as a story or a state of mind. Most of us see it as a story. And so the question, can I get out of here alive? The answer is no. Because that's not what the story is about. The story is about dying. It's about sin, separation, pain, suffering. A moment or two of semi-happiness, but come on. No. But if you see the eternal you, then the story becomes something else. Now the story is a state of mind. And if it's a state of mind, and we are a mind, in mind, purely mind, as our lesson a couple of days ago said, then death makes no sense. There's just nothing there that would allow you to experience a thought that could be called death. The Course begins by telling us that there are those things that are real and those things that are not real. Those things that are real are those things that are in alignment with the thought of God, the thought of love. Those things that are not real, everything else. And from each of those two thought systems, a world will arise, and we can see either one. But to look at the world that we see and recognize it as a state of mind, takes a long time to get past that, doesn't it? It's amazing how our perception will always accommodate itself. And by that I mean that if I define him, describe him even in my own mind as an unloving, uncaring bastard, that will always be the way I see him, and I will not forgive him. That's how mind perception accommodates itself. But if you were willing just to say, and this can only happen if it's what you really want. Mm-hmm. If you were willing to say, I see this man asking me to be loved, to convince him that he is lovable. If I saw him that way, how would I react? Would I with love? Or would I say, no, I really would like you to know that you are lovable? You see, you've changed the whole perspective there, just in the desire to see him differently. And that is what the Course means when it tells us we can see differently.
Isn't that the definition of miracle, is to change the perception?
It exactly is. And the miracle is that the mind then accommodates itself in the other way. Mm-hmm. So it's learning that we have the tool to change our mind. Mm-hmm. And that tool, quite simply, is just what Jim said when we began the meeting tonight. You decide you want to.
So make a decision, be willing.
And just say to your God self, help me to show him how loving he is. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a little story. This has been 20 years ago, probably. We were in New York doing a gathering, and a woman was saying a similar story, but it was about her daughter and how her daughter wouldn't even allow her to see their grandchild. And this thing that they had going between them, and her daughter did this, and her daughter never appreciated that, and she always was. So I said something similar to what I've just said to you. What do you really want from this? She had to think about it for a while, because the hatred ran so deep that she wasn't sure that she would want to see this person in a different way. Finally, after a lot of conversation, she said, well, I think I could try it. So that was one evening. The next day, when we regathered again, she held up her hand and said, I have something I need to say. She said, I called my daughter last night, and rather than hanging up the phone when she heard my voice. She said to me, "You know, Mom, I think we've been doing this unloving thing long enough." I mean, what a perfect example of how our consciousness accommodates itself. All she did was just say, "I'll try it." Opened the door, just opened the door, and love came in. About 2 weeks ago, I was going through, as I've shared with you from time to time, I get temper tantrums and let myself express myself, usually to brother, but this time it was to God, because I was reading the course just after I had been watching the news about this terrible bombing that had happened in Syria, and they were digging kids out of the rubble, and so I'm saying to God, sometimes it seems the reality of the world is just too much to overlook. It's so easy to get lost in the need to overcome it. It's so enticing to think that I can see what is wrong and know how to fix it. Know how to fix it. So I ask, Father, when we feel lost in this world we have made, what would be the most helpful thing for us to know? I hear him say, remember this above all else, in spite of every fear-filled dream that ever has been dreamed, there never has been a moment I have not been with you, or that you have been left without my love. That's what the Course has taught me. So, thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming. See you next week.
Yeah.
I'll share with you an experience I had last night as I was preparing, having my meditation before going to sleep. Mark and Pam and Linda and I had been sitting out on the deck, and one thing, topic of conversation led to another, and finally I found myself beginning to kind of, for me at least, wildly begin to rant about our president and the Congress and all of the terrible things that were going on and so on and so forth. And so it went, and then a little bit later I'm going to bed and I'm just not feeling very well. You know, just kind of at odds and my stomach's kind of tense. And so I said, Brother, what's going on here? And he said, well, you know, he says, I can think of any number of times when you have said to me that it was your desire to just come to know yourself as a loving person. And he said that was what was really important to you. But he said, tonight, a little bit ago, he said, you decided momentarily that something else was important. And just the way he said it, it was just so typical of not making a judgment, but just letting me know that's the way it is when we forget for a moment. What makes the tangible tangible?
Maybe our belief in it.
You think? Could there be something else?
Our wanting.
Could there be something else?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
That's so.
No. So, by the same token then, take away the body, take away the physicality, and what really makes the difference about how you would experience it? Nothing except your choice. So it's not like we're going to miss something or be left out of something. We still have no concept of what it's like to change your mind and how everything then changes to accommodate that one single thing. See yourself from the perspective of being a thought of God. And if it becomes okay with you, acceptable to you, to do that, then guess what? Everything that's required to embody that, to make that experience whole and real and meaningful to you, is there. We are not circumstances of the world. We are the circumstance within which the world seems to appear.
Co-creator. Yeah.
That's what he means when he says we are co-creators of the world.
Yeah. It's ours as much as it's his.
Yeah, well, of course it must be, mustn't it? If you can't separate the two, for years and years I used to think, I don't know if I'm ready to give all this up or not. What is to give up?
Yeah, that's right.
What would I give up? What would you give up?
An illusion.
This lesson 190 I am particularly fond of because it seems to encapsulate all of the other lessons within it. At one point or another, it touches on everything the Course teaches. So let's take a closer look at it. Read it, digest it, see if there's something here that perhaps we've even missed before. Just feel the impact of that headline. I choose the joy of God instead of pain. Like immediately it's saying I have a choice. And what is the choice? What choice do we always choose between?
Heaven and hell.
Yeah.
Heaven and hell.
What it says to me is there's pain here. Why don't I choose something else?
Where is the pain, Brian?
It's in my perception.
Pain is a wrong perspective. When it is experienced in any form, it is a proof of self-deception. It is not a fact at all. There is no form it takes that will not disappear if seen aright. For pain proclaims God cruel. How could it be real in any form? It witnesses to God the Father's hatred of his Son, the sinfulness he sees in him, and his insane desire for revenge and death.
All of that in our experience of pain. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? What's the alternative if you don't? Pain is a wrong perspective. When it is experienced in any form, it is a proof of self-deception. You believe that? As beautiful as these sayings are, and as much as we turn to them, constantly turn to them, do we believe them? Having come through what you've come through, honey,
When I was in the worst of the physical pain, it's like I wanted to believe this. I wanted to believe that I just needed to change my perception. I knew I couldn't, but I knew you guys could. And so that was where I turned my prayer to, was turning it over to you guys. Because I wanted to believe it, but I couldn't get there. I was in too much agony. But I believed it enough to know you guys could do for me what I couldn't do for myself.
that is so beautiful, Laurel, so beautiful. And so much more impactful even than what we're reading here. You turn to the one thing that we deny the most, and it works. You turn to the truth of our oneness. I love particularly Laurel saying that even in the depth of the pain, even though she was aware that she couldn't get out of it by herself, there was the awareness that the pain was not true and another source that she could turn to. How many of us would have turned away and said, then that must mean either that I never am going to get it or that it isn't true? I mean, here I'm reading and I'm being taught in so many different ways that pain is not real. And yet I am in pain. Why? Why? We've all asked ourselves that probably 1,000 times. How can that be? Does that mean that everything else that we're learning is untrue? Does it mean that we should condemn ourselves then if it is true and we don't get it? You see, honey, that what you did was the ultimate testament to your belief, even in your disbelief. And I don't see how any of us could learn faith in a better way than that. How many times do we read in the Course that when we share a loving thought, that we share it with everyone? Well, this is saying there isn't anything that comes from an outside source that has any influence on you at all. So how do you rectify those two situations? It's so simple. The principle is exactly true. There is nothing outside of you that can cause you any experience whatsoever. But remember, the one thing that we all want the most is to know that we are loved and know that we are capable of loving. That's the one thing we all can agree upon. And whenever we feel someone offering us love, what do? We open our heart and accept it, because that's what we want. So it's not coming to us from the outside. It's our opening to what's there and accepting it. And the same is true for the experience of the pain. If we opened our heart to accept what's really there, then what would happen to the pain? There isn't any place in that space where pain can exist. So we are closed off entirely when we are in pain. That's the self-deception that he's talking about. When there's a sense of everything being in harmony with everything else, there's a total sense of peace, and that's when the mind is still. But it's not that the mind is stopped. It's just that it sees nothing to be in conflict.
Nothing to judge.
Nothing to judge. Thank you, Jim. Yes. This came to me when I was experiencing a moment of frustration, thinking I was never going to quite wise up to the truth. Sometimes it seems the reality of the world is too much to overlook. It's so easy to get lost in the need to overcome it. So enticing to think I can see what is wrong and how to fix it. So I asked, Father, when we are lost in this world we have made, what would be the most helpful thing for us to know? I hear, remember this, in spite of every fear-filled dream that ever has been dreamed, there has never been a moment I have not been with you, or that you have been left without my love. So simple. Never a moment when we have been alone. Mind has a thing called belief. It's what awareness trusts most, and we call that belief. That thing, that trust, is the determining factor for our entire world experience. And if we are ever to change our world experience, that's the change that we have to make. So who else? Let's take a look at some of our other uses for the body.
Without my body, I don't exist.
Without my body, I don't exist. Does that sound familiar?
I don't see any opening to get past that.
That's kind of the purpose for this whole little process that we're going through right now. Most of us don't. You see, we take it for granted that the body is, in fact, or that we wouldn't, in fact, exist without the illustration that the body provides. But the fact of the matter, the truth of the matter is that without the mind, the body plays no role at all in our experience. Without the mind, the body does not exist.
There you go.
Without the mind, the world that seems to see does not exist. I was kind of going through that process myself this morning. Looking out the window and the water was so serene and sun sparkling off it, and I thought, well, that's really very beautiful. Then the thought came into my mind, why? I was sitting there asking myself, okay, why is that beautiful? Who determined? Is it beautiful in and of itself? In and of itself?
No.
It's not even there. So what makes it beautiful?
Your decision.
Yeah.
The meaning you give it.
Yeah, my decision, my choice. And then, of course, the next thought that has to come is, what wouldn't be beautiful if I made that same choice? I could look at an automobile accident and say, that's not so beautiful. I could look at the road as I drive up Teal Lake Road and see all of the logging and everything that's happened and think to myself, that's not beautiful. Same reason. Why? Because I've chosen
Yeah.
to see something that is opposite from something that is beautiful. So, knowing that, as Tom pointed out, we see the world as an extension of how we see ourselves, can this be anything other than my choice to divide how I see myself? This old thing that we call the conflicted, separated mind. And who makes that choice but each of us? What would keep us from choosing to see everything being beautiful? What would keep us from doing that would simply be my choice not to see myself that way. Now perhaps we can begin to get a glimpse of what he means when he talks to us about being non-judgmental. In other words, we start watching the judgments we make and then asking ourselves, why, what value did that judgment have in determining who they were versus who I am? And inevitably, you have to come to the conclusion that it was simply their body that you were judging. That's the only thing that you were concerned with.
Behavior.
The behavior. See, the thing is, it's not what we see or hear or feel out here that has any reference on what's going on in here. It begins just the opposite. It's what I see and hear, regardless of my sight, my physical sight, or my hearing, that becomes the basis for my seeing. So whether or not that physical sight could come to fruition or it was non-existent, that doesn't change what I've seen inside. You understand that? Everything out here is just a manifestation of what I have seen to begin with in here. So I'm not trying to change what I see out here. I'm trying to use it as a barometer to see what's in here in a different way, to become more aware of what it is that I'm seeing in here. Because most of us so easily take it for granted that what we see is that's just it. That's the way it is. But it's not. The ego would find simply another way of illustrating the truth of what it thinks it sees inside. And that's what we're trying to do, is to loosen that foundation of purpose so that we can become aware that within our mind, within this mind that we cloud over with our perception, there exists a different way of seeing. The Course refers to it as vision, to separate the two, just to distinguish between seeing and vision. And that vision is of a different world. That vision reveals a different self. And once we are looking through the eyes of that different self, the world changes. Everything we see changes to match the vision now of what we see within. And it's what the Course calls the real world. See, what we talk about, and this again is a lesson perhaps in understanding one of our intrinsic misperceptions, is that the mind, so-called mind, is what does the thinking. The mind holds the thoughts, and the soul, if we can make some kind of a distinction, interprets that either from the point of view, from its belief, but either from the point of view that it is whole or that it is separated and is different from other parts. So here we have the mind, but within the mind there are multiple awarenesses. One awareness would be, there's nothing wrong with you. You are the experience and the expression of love. And so from that awareness, we create an experience that reflects the truth of that awareness. Or, in the same mind, there is a different awareness. And that awareness is, sin is real. There's something wrong with you. You've really screwed up many places along the line. And so what do we experience from that awareness? Something that confirms the truth of that awareness. What happens is that as the mind opens and there are less areas of denial, this thing we call belief becomes less firm, less entrenched in any one thought, any one awareness system. And so, whereas an ego or a God self sees very clearly only a single awareness, you're now seeing various awarenesses, each of which seems to carry a believable factor of belief. And so it's very confusing. Instead of being able to look at one area of belief and attribute your experience all to that, you're having multiple experiences because you have multiple beliefs carrying the same weight. And so we have what we sometimes call an idiot savant, perhaps. Autism is another example of that. What we call genius is an example of that. The mind, the belief is not fixed in any one area, as most of us do experience it. My belief comes from the awareness that there's something wrong. And so I've always been trying to go about fixing it rather than just stepping away and saying, wait, there isn't anything wrong. See, now I shift my belief from one position to a different position, and so my experience changes. Well, we just need to keep in mind that what we define as real, or what the Course defines as real, is a thought that is in alignment with the thought of God, or a thought that is in alignment with the belief in love. So anything not in alignment with that, the Course teaches us is not real, and therefore encourages us to let it go through the process of forgiveness. And the Course says this is all a reflection of our authority problem. You remember how it defines our authority problem? We believe that we can change what God created. If I believe it, it's true. Never mind what God says or even thinking about the difference. We trust implicitly in our belief. We always have. And until, well, it's not just this book, because this information began to come to us many, many, many generations ago. Well, the very moment that we began to exercise our perception, we became aware that that perception was false. And then the fear arose that, my God, if it is false, what does that mean is true about me? Well, we can't go there, so we have to fall back into just accepting that perception. But there's not a person who has ever lived who is not aware on some level that their perception is entirely false. Because you can't begin from any other point than the fact that you are perfectly now as God created you, and end up at any other place that is true. You've got to begin with the kernel of what is true and let it grow. You see, all of our problems and misunderstandings come from trying to filter the truth through our perception. And fortunately, it doesn't work. We're still trying to hang on to some vestige of this perception, because that perception seems to say who we are. But we're trying to hang on to some little kernel of what we believe that is true. And we can't. Everything we believe is part of this illusion. Everything we believe is what has made this illusion.
Everything we believe keeps the truth away, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. Because we're beginning with an untrue premise, and trying to cultivate it.
Yeah, to make it work.
Water it, fertilize it, change it. I remember a long time ago, I said to Brother, I'm getting so fed up with all of this because nothing I seem to do works. So tell me, what is the one thing I could do that would make a difference? And he said, see yourself as you see me. Just that. Why is that so damn difficult? Only because I am convinced there is still something wrong in me.
Well, that message was directed toward yourself, capital S, which is not your body.
No. No.
So see your holy mind as you see God.
And it's so funny because I have absolutely no desire to see his physical form. I don't equate anything I think about him being physical at all.
Well, you could say the same thing about your mind.
That's what we're trying to learn, what I'm trying to learn. Yes. Yeah. There's something wrong and therefore we are separate. That's the one overriding premise that controls our perception entirely.
However, if I'm interpreting it correctly, the Course does tell us that the Holy Spirit can use the body as a means of communication.
Yes.
How does it do that? How does it communicate with the body without going through the brain?
The brain doesn't play any part in it, Raj. It's just mind to mind. It's all one mind. We all exist, there's only one mind. So we all exist in that same mind.
So the Holy Spirit is using the body.
Can use.
Mm-hmm.
Can use.
Yeah, can use the body as a means of communication.
Yes.
Without communicating with the body.
Well, there isn't any communicating with the body except the brain making the body function. That's the only communication between the brain and the body.
The
It has
body
to-
is a thought in the mind. So the
There we
Holy
go.
Spirit is communicating with the
There
thought.
you go. That's it.
So once we really see ourselves as we are, all illusion, again, this keeps coming up. All of this will pass away. None of this is, we'll just disappear.
And what's going to make it pass away? We replace the
realization.
thought of how we see ourselves. Don't make it more complicated than that. We change the way we see ourselves, and everything that doesn't configure with that will pass away. Now, we don't know how to attain that. So God, being a little smarter than we are, said, here's an idea. I'll place this thing, let's call it a Holy Spirit. I'll place that in our mind. So if you're ever confused, here's a place for you to go. Here's a vision for you to hold that will replace the seeing of your perception. You see, he keeps telling us that because there are so many who continue to think like we think and can't hear the voice for God. So we can communicate, we can fill that gap, and we can communicate what we hear from the voice for God. And so for those who can't hear the Holy Spirit, we become the voice for God. First, it is very difficult for us to be able to measure how much of the illusion we still accept as truth. And secondly, there is this thing we call the consciousness, and we are all a part of it. And when that consciousness lets go, we will all be awakened from it. And until it does, there's only one awakening. But the question is, how do we, seeing what we see, knowing that the world is our perception, the perception of our own self-image, how do we deal with this being seemingly on the verge of catastrophe, as the world would know it?
remind myself that this situation with North Korea isn't real because none of this is real, except love.
Yes. Yes, that's all very true. Does that, in itself, how does that affect the situation?
Wouldn't it have a great effect?
Well, we're certainly told that it would.
Yeah. But if I spend a lot of time, pardon the expression, pissing and moaning about what's wrong with the world, it's only going to get worse.
How many of us would be able or would see taking our desire to be loving and applying that in a particular any particular situation that happens to be in your sphere of interest right now, with the intention that it also applied to what was happening on a global scale? In other words, most of the time, we would feel rather helpless because we would think there wasn't anything we could do to directly influence that situation. But if we knew that all situations were manifestations of the same one problem in our consciousness, then as we were willing to apply the solution to an individual issue within our own sphere, how could that not affect what's happening everywhere? If all of these issues are the same, then it would have to have some effect, and on us individually, it would be a lot more effective because we would be doing something that we could see directly that was changing our own perception from being fearful to being loving. And isn't it lovely when you put that meaning, attach that meaning to the things that you're doing, when you are consciously attempting to influence globally, influence the flow of loving. And called me, and it was a friend from California, a person we've known when we used to go down there part of the year. And he was having a bad day. And my goodness, it was this and it was that. And the moment I felt his consternation. The years of study that we've all done kicked in. And it was like, And my demeanor about myself changed. My whole frustrations just kind of went out the window. And he ranted and raved for a little bit, and then he stopped and he said, I appreciate you letting me do that because I just want you to know I feel you and I know that everything is okay.
Wow.
You can always rely upon one fact when your mind gets cloudy and hazy about someone that you may be dealing with. There is no one in the world, no one, who does not want to know that they are loved and capable of loving. So when I apply that to like Kim Jong-un, his activities must be promoted or provoked by his feeling of being unlovable. A huge call for love, yes. So when I'm wondering how to deal with these people, the more pronounced the call for love seems to be, doesn't that or shouldn't that indicate to me to have a clearer intention of being loving? Now the thing that always screws us up is that we're saying to ourselves, yeah, but look at what he's doing. What he's doing is playing a part of a character in a story that isn't real. What am I doing? I'm playing another part of a character in a story that isn't real. Is the part I play any better than the part he plays? Only if the story is real. If it isn't, how can I judge between those characters? What is there to judge between those characters?
So it's like saying you watch a Batman movie and who's playing his part better, Batman or the Joker?
Exactly right.
You're right.
Yes. Yes, who is playing a better part? Course tells us in the very beginning that its purpose is singular. Its purpose is to teach us to tell the difference between what's real and what's not. It doesn't even say that it's going to get into showing us how to fix the story, just to tell the difference. Because once we do see the difference between what's real and what's not, the story is done. Just seeing the difference is all it takes. So now, what part of the question have we not answered? The issue is not whether or not the world is real and just part of a big stage. The issue is the part you play in seeing it that way. In other words, you're not wondering about the reality of the world. You are confused about the reality of the part, the self, that you seem to be. But you see, if you're focusing on the part about whether or not the world is real, there just isn't any way to come up with an answer. Because it's something out here. It's something that will elude you. Because right now, in the frame of mind that we are all in, the world is nothing more than feeding back to us what it needs to feed back to us. So we're not going to change any of that. But if we change, and if we ask for help in changing, how to see ourselves vis-a-vis everything else, now there's something that we can relate to. Now we have asked a question that can be answered, and we can hear the answer because it's us. Reality doesn't change. The real you has never changed. You have never changed what God created you to be, and you can't. So that's the part, that's the thing that you want to be able to connect to. It's absolutely meaningless to say, help me to see a changeless world, until you have asked to see a changeless self. Are you attempting to see from the perspective of wholeness or of division? Those are the occasions that we need the help with. Those are the diversions that so easily distract us. So always remember, the ego is always going to try to say to you, to get you to try to make a decision about what's real and what's not real, based upon what it sees. And that's an impossible situation. The Holy Spirit will help you to see yourself differently, to see yourself from the point of view of being changeless. And that's what then changes how and what you see. I don't remember what lesson this came from, but it so impressed me I turned it into a bookmark. What has been given you? The knowledge that you are a mind, in mind and purely mind, sinless forever, wholly unafraid, because you were created out of love, nor have you left your source, remaining as you were created. This was given you as knowledge, which you cannot lose. It was given as well to every living thing, for by that knowledge only does it live. By that knowledge only does it live. Now, what is the purpose? What is the change in purpose that we are asked to see? When he says, you must change your mind about the purpose of the world if you would escape. What are we asked to see as the purpose of the world? In a word, forgiveness. The world exists as a projection of how I see myself. And so it exists as the opportunity for me to see a holy self. Instead of to see the sinful self, the separated self, it is to see the holy Son of God. So forgiveness, changing that, changing every circumstance, changing the way I see every circumstance, is the opportunity of changing the purpose for the entire world. To remind myself when I seem to be dealing with some abstract issue, that I get the most help when I apply it directly to a circumstance that seems to be in my life. They're all the same, whether we're trying to solve a Korean problem or a neighbor problem or a problem within our own fearful system. It's all the same. But the meaning that we give it is so much more personal when we apply it to something that seems to be troubling us. Let me offer a subject that I would like to have us take a look at today. In many places and in many different ways throughout the course, Brother talks to us about God's plan. And in lesson 135, what could you not accept if you but knew that there was a plan? How do you feel about the idea of God having a plan for you? For you, specifically for you.
No, that's what felt so good.
We all have this feeling we can agree on, don't we? That it's a relief to really know that God has a plan for us. But what I found myself wondering was how many times I relied upon that plan. And as I recognized how little I rely upon His plan, it became terribly obvious of why I still kept thinking that my plan would have some merit, could have any merit when compared with God's plan. So, how do you feel about that?
I can tell you how I feel about it. I wouldn't.
We all have this feeling we can agree on, don't we? That it's a relief to really know that God has a plan for us. But what I found myself wondering was how many times I relied upon that plan. And as I recognized how little I rely upon His plan, it became terribly obvious of why I still kept thinking that my plan would have some merit, could have any merit when compared with God's plan. So, how do you feel about that? How do you draw a connection between your will and God's will being connected and this business we're talking about of listening to God's plan and not your own? How do you make heads or tails of that? I wonder how much of free will we would ever feel a need to exercise if we were within the scope of God's plan. If we were recognizing ourselves as being that His will and our will were the same. It seems to me that free will is pretty much confined to the ego's definition. To try to accommodate something that the ego needs for itself as an autonomy of sorts, to prove that there is a will outside of God's will.
Yeah, I think I've lived that way. I think that's fair to say. I've been trying to prove there is a will outside of God's will.
We all are. We all are. Obviously, or we wouldn't be living a life of differences. We wouldn't be looking for ways to prove our differences rather than ways to prove our sameness. What's the difference between, let's say, a hurricane and sickness?
They're all part of the story, huh? Neither one is real.
Well, we are sometimes want to do, Brian. We try to want to know what's causing it, so because we think we can fix it. So, what would the difference be between someone suffering pain and loss in a hurricane and someone suffering pain and loss during a sickness? Why would it be that so many people could seem to be influenced, impacted by a storm? I mean, do they all have to have the same belief? The answer very simply is Yes. Yes.
It's all consciousness, right?
It's all part of the consciousness.
Yeah.
And the consciousness is all connected. The belief is the same in the consciousness. Okay? The belief is that sin and separation are real. That is the foundation for the belief of the consciousness. So we all share in it. So there are people in Texas who are experiencing a hurricane, as we experienced a hurricane in Kauai, and there are people other places who are experiencing cancer, any other form that the belief that there's something wrong with you can manifest itself in. So what can we do? Immediately, for the people who seem to be most severely impacted by this, for instance, this storm that's now wreaking such devastation in the Houston area, what can we do? What do you feel inclined to do?
I think what would be helpful for everyone would be to focus my thoughts more on love. Whether I did that and then tried to send it to the people in Houston, I don't know if that'd be helpful or not.
Well, you don't need to try to send it, whatever you do. If you hold it in your mind, it's as available to them as it is my thoughts would be for Tom.
Yeah.
I mean, distance is irrelevant
Yeah.
in the mind. If it is their thoughts that they are experiencing, then what would be the most significantly helpful thing that we could do? What thought could we hold that would impact that in the most powerful way? When you are down, what is the greatest help to you? What helps you most quickly to pick up your thoughts?
To feel loved.
To feel loved. And even in the next moment, can I influence what's happening in that moment by my thought? And the answer is yes, you can. Now it may seem to occur within the context of the storm itself, but your experience, which is what we're talking about, your experience will be impacted by your belief about the purpose that it's serving. And so if we can connect, if we can hold an awareness of purely loving for these folks, purely loving, we are allowing ourselves to speak to the most fundamental part of the ego's perception that experiences pain and suffering. If you have any doubts at all about fundamentally changing your mind or offering a different thought, then take your intention of loving in the moment to the God Self and say, this is the intention that I would like to extend. Let it happen on your behalf. You can call it a projection,
What did you say? I didn't.
an extension, or a projection, or take this thought that I would like to extend to someone and do it for me. Do it in a manner that is more pure, let's say, than what I think I am capable of in the moment. Do it for me. The greatest downfall that we have in our awakening process is the belief that we can somehow use our ego to facilitate it. Teaching ourselves, in every moment, teaching ourselves that we have an alternative is the most significant thing. You suppose every page, nearly every paragraph, talks about the Holy Spirit. Why doesn't he say you instead of the God Self or the Holy Spirit? For us, the Holy Spirit is the real self. It is who we are. And its function is to be the bridge between the reality of the thought of God and the illusion of the thought of the ego. And yet how frequently do we use it? Not very frequently. We're addicted to the belief that we can do something with our ego, that we can make some kind of change, thinking, first of all, that we know the change that needs to be made. Only one part of our judgment that we're asked to rely on, and that's our intention to seek out the presence of the God Self. Everything else is a function of the ego, and it's not going to work. It's not going to change anything. But we are asked to be vigilant for our thoughts. And the one thought that we can be vigilant of is, in this moment, is it my intention to be loving? Is it my intention to forgive, to extend compassion and mercy in whatever form that it may seem most appropriate? Is it my intention to do that? Yes. God Self, do it for me. Do it for me. That's what I was saying specifically, is to rely upon your intention in that moment to be loving. You have that ability. Don't deny it. You have that ability. And even if it is momentarily tinged with doubt, that doubt can be bridged by the God Self.
Okay, but look, okay, so when this happened to me, they are and evaluating them.
Do you want to know how to change that?
Yeah, I do. Well,
Tell yourself right now.
okay.
Right now. Tell yourself, I'm serious.
Yeah.
Tell yourself that was okay.
That was okay.
That thought, that slipping away thought,
Oh, that was okay.
that's okay. No problem.
You
No
mean
harm done. That's okay. Release yourself, Denny, from the judgment.
Okay, just so I'm sure just to make sure that I understand what you're saying. So you're saying that that was okay, that I went back into this constricted consciousness, for me to say that was okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And release myself from my self-judgment.
That was the only thing that was dragging you down, was your self-doubt, your self-judgment. See what we're saying? We're saying you can rely on that 1 minute, that 30 seconds of intention. You can rely on that. You can trust it. And use it. And then if you fall away, just step back and say, well, I've done that before. It's okay. It's okay. It's not a problem. Nothing changed. Nothing changed.
Yeah.
And the more we are able to do that, the fewer times it's going to slip away. You see, if you take away the consequences from the ego's judgment, what's the point of the ego judging?
Isn't that what Course says? Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal.
Absolutely. Nothing real can be threatened. And who determines whether or not?
That's me.
What does it mean to love yourself?
Acceptance.
Well, don't you first have to come to an awareness of what you mean by self?
That would be to love the unity.
To love the one self. Can you love the ego self? You can't. You know why? The ego won't let you. The ego doesn't know love. So when you are in a state of mind that believes the ego exists, that the ego is real, because you're trying to love it, you wouldn't be trying to love it if you didn't think it was real. So when you're in that state of mind where the ego seems real, and you're saying to yourself, what does it take to love this ego self? The answer is nothing. Because you're suddenly trying to love or extend reality to something that only exists in your story. So, how do you love yourself? You go to the God self, and you simply say, show me this self that I can love. And then, love it for me. When he says, what could you not do? How could you not do what the Christ asks when it is you who is doing the asking, when you are the Christ? But you see, what we're trying to find is how to get over that hurdle of the self that I believe is true to connect with the self that is real. So how will we best help anyone who is suffering from anything, let alone the millions of people who are being impacted by this storm? How will we best help them? What is the most significant thing that you could do to facilitate your awakening?
Stop judging.
Stop judging? And why would you stop judging?
Because that's where all my attack thoughts seem to arise from.
What will allow you to do that, Jim?
To embrace myself the way I am.
Just that. Just accept the self you now see. You can even accept what isn't. This is important. It is not in the thing you are accepting. It is in your willingness to accept. Okay? So when Brother, as he told us, 6-7 months ago, accept the self you now see, he was saying whatever self you now see, accept it. Accept it. Refuse to judge it. And what happens? All of the reasons that you've had in the past for not accepting it go away. And what are you left with? When you take away every illusion that the ego has ever conceived of, what are you left with? You are left with the presence of God, dear friends, the presence of God.
Yeah.
And the reality, the truth of who you are is what you're left with. Forgiveness recognizes what you thought your brother did to you has not occurred. Anybody have any trouble with that?
The important part of that for me is the corollary. What I think I have done to my brother has not occurred either.
It's assuming that we have accepted the Course's version of what perception is. That perception is nothing more than a mirror of our self-condemnation, and then project that onto the world at large, and that becomes what we call perception. That becomes a way of thinking that colors everything it sees, and we categorize that as guilt. So we take the belief in sin, we say it's real, so then everything that I do that I can judge about myself is my self-condemnation, being sinful, and I project that feeling, that thought process onto everything I see, and that's what we call perception. Do you feel capable of extending love to those people who are in dire need?
We're the ones who are in dire need. All of us. The one.
Or at least we think so.
To get out of this dream.
The easiest way out of the dream, my friend, is simply to recognize there is no real dream. So each time we look for a way to justify judging, what can we find? What would justify judging something that has no basis in reality? Only insanity. Let's just take a minute, because that's all it will really take. Let's call our God self into our conscious presence, and let's simply affirm that it is our intention to extend love in the way, and sometimes in the form, that it is most needed by everyone, everywhere. It's not even necessary to make judgment of that kind a bad thing. You can judge, and it's obviously a judgment to say, I need help with this. It's a judgment to say, God self, this obviously is a bunch of crud, so I need you to get rid of it. Those are all judgments, however you would like to phrase them. But if that judgment is used to the end of removing you from guilt, then it's worthwhile, because you have given it to the God self to do for you, and it will not lead you to further judgment. Why, we would have to ask ourselves, why would the ego feel guilty about not judging? Who would not forgive must judge, for he must justify his failure to forgive. Why would we need a justification not to judge? Do you suppose it's because we know, somewhere we already know, that there is no sin? But I ask the question, and it's not one that we can answer except in our own quiet time. And that is the question of whether or not how I feel about the world. Am I willing to let it go? And it's the same question about our bodies. Am I at a point where I can say I am not a body? Truly, I am not a body. There is so much of our perception that we hold on to without recognizing that we're holding it. There's so much that it continues to close us off from the truth. And one of the issues that we need to address that is the most difficult to address is this business of retaining the world. Holding on to it,
Yeah.
simply because we made it. This is our creation. It's true. This is the part of our creation that, as the Course tells us, is an attack upon God. Because it tries to assert the reality of it over the reality of God's creation. The mechanisms of illusion, how well we have done this, how perfectly we have made this dream. But you see, we have also given ourselves little escape routes, one of which I would suggest is this thing we call the internet. It's a way for us to experience the effects of instantaneously being with whatever is without committing to oneness. So mechanically, we're experiencing what the ego would imagine are the effects of one mind, where everything exists. So you see, it's not about the world. It's about the judgment that we have made upon ourselves, which is signified so totally in the idea that we must die, that death is real. Is that clear for everyone? This idea of letting go of the world is not about the world. We have made the world in the image of a self that must die, that must suffer the effects of sin and separation. So we must save the world so that we can see it through the eyes he calls the eyes of Christ, the eyes of loving, so that we no longer condemn the self that made the world. You are the something that never died. To bring that awareness back into our focus. Yes. Thank you for doing what you did today. I think it was important that we all could express our intention in that way.